I received an email from my deceased twin's account. The subject line said, "I need your help now." My cursor hovered over the message for 30 seconds before I could force myself to click it. Adrian had been dead for 7 months, killed in what police called a random mugging gone wrong outside his apartment in Chicago. I was in Seattle attending a conference when I got the call from his roommate screaming that Adrian was bleeding out on the sidewalk, waiting for an ambulance that arrived too late. The email address was his personal account, the one he'd used since college, and the timestamp showed it had been sent at 3 a.m. my time. I opened it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and found a single line of text followed by an attachment. "They're covering it up, and I have proof. Download this before they find it." The attachment was labeled evidence.zip, and my antivirus software immediately flagged it as potentially dangerous, asking if I wanted to proceed anyway. I downloaded the file to an external drive and extracted it in a sandbox environment because 7 months of grief hadn't made me stupid enough to trust random attachments even from my dead brother's account. Inside were hundreds of documents, scanned police reports with sections redacted in black ink, financial records showing wire transfers to numbered accounts, photographs of Adrian meeting with people I didn't recognize, and a video file dated 2 days before his death. My stomach clenched as I clicked the video and Adrian's face filled my screen, his expression tense and exhausted. He was sitting in his car filming himself on his phone, his voice low and urgent as he explained he'd stumbled onto something massive while working as a data analyst for a private security firm. He said the company was falsifying background checks for government contracts, hiring people with criminal records and fabricating their credentials, and when he'd tried to report it internally, his supervisor had told him to delete everything and forget what he'd seen. Adrian's video continued with him explaining he'd made copies of everything before his work computer was wiped remotely, that he'd been followed for 3 days straight by cars with tinted windows, that someone had broken into his apartment while he was at work and gone through his files without taking anything valuable. He looked directly into the camera and said if anyone was watching this, it meant something had happened to him, and the evidence needed to reach federal investigators before the company could bury it completely. The video ended with him giving the names of 3 journalists he'd contacted and a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower cases. Then he reached forward, and the screen went black. I sat there staring at my monitor trying to process what I'd just watched, my rational brain insisting this had to be some kind of elaborate hack, while every instinct screamed that my brother had been murdered and his killers had successfully made it look random. I called the detective who'd handled Adrian's case, a woman named Carol Finch, who'd been sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful during the investigation. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding annoyed at the late hour until I explained who I was and why I was calling. I told her about the email and the evidence file, asked if she'd be willing to look at what Adrian had collected before he died. Detective Finch was quiet for a long moment before she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me the case had been closed 4 months ago, that her supervisor had ordered her to stop investigating after the initial reports were filed, and when she'd pushed back asking why, she'd been told the directive came from higher up and she should focus on cases that were actually solvable. I asked what that meant, and she said in a careful voice that sometimes cases got political pressure applied to make them go away, that she couldn't say more over the phone, but if I wanted to meet in person, she'd be willing to look at what I had. We met the next morning at a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us frequented, Finch arriving in civilian clothes instead of her usual suit. She looked around the cafe carefully before sitting across from me and accepting the laptop I'd brought with Adrian's files loaded. She spent 40 minutes going through everything in silence, her expression growing darker with each document she reviewed. When she finally looked up, she asked if I'd shown this to anyone else, and I said no, that I'd come to her first because she'd seemed to actually care about finding Adrian's killer. Finch closed the laptop and leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper, as she explained that the security company Adrian had worked for, Sentinel Risk Solutions, had contracts with multiple federal agencies, including Homeland Security and the State Department, that they provided personnel for sensitive operations and embassy security, and that those contracts were worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Finch explained that if Adrian's evidence was accurate, it meant Sentinel had been placing unvetted personnel in positions with access to classified information and secure facilities, creating potential security breaches that could compromise national operations. She said this was the kind of scandal that could bring down government officials who'd approved the contracts, that people with serious power had serious motivation to make sure the story never became public. I asked why she was telling me this, instead of taking the evidence to her superiors, and she gave me a bitter smile. She said she'd tried 4 months ago after Adrian's death, had gone to her captain with suspicions that the mugging wasn't random, and had been told explicitly to drop it or face disciplinary action for insubordination. Her captain had mentioned that Sentinel had friends in city government, that pursuing this would be career suicide, and that she had a family to think about. I felt rage building in my chest as I processed what she was telling me, that my twin brother had been killed by people with enough influence to shut down a murder investigation, that the system designed to protect citizens had instead protected his killers. I asked Finch what I should do with the evidence, and she said I had two options. I could take it to the federal authorities and hope someone with integrity would act on it, knowing that Sentinel almost certainly had people inside those agencies who would alert the company the moment an investigation started, or I could go public, release everything to journalists, and let the court of public opinion force action, knowing that would make me a target for the same people who'd killed Adrian. Neither option was safe, and both required me to accept that my life was about to become exponentially more complicated and dangerous. I spent the next 3 days researching Sentinel Risk Solutions, using Adrian's employee credentials that I found in his files to access internal company systems he'd left open. The company had been founded 12 years ago by a former military contractor named Gregory Voss, who'd built his reputation providing security during the Iraq War. Sentinel had grown rapidly by underbidding competitors on government contracts, their prices so much lower than established firms that they'd won dozens of contracts despite having less experience. Adrian's financial records showed why their costs were so low. They were hiring people who couldn't pass legitimate background checks, paying them a fraction of industry standard wages, and pocketing the difference while billing the government for fully vetted professionals. The scheme had generated over $40 million in fraudulent profits over 5 years. I found emails between Voss and his operations director discussing specific employees whose criminal backgrounds had been discovered, and deciding whether to fire them quietly or falsify additional documentation to keep them in place. One email chain made me physically sick, a discussion about an employee who'd been flagged for a violent assault conviction, but was kept on assignment at a State Department facility because replacing him would trigger a contract review. The operations director had written that they should monitor the situation and have documentation ready to blame the hiring on a subcontractor if anything went wrong. Voss had responded approving the plan and joking that plausible deniability was worth its weight in gold. These weren't mistakes or oversights. They were calculated decisions to prioritize profit over security and safety. Adrian's files included a list of journalists he'd contacted before his death, 3 names with contact information, and notes about their specialties. The first was Diane Mercer, who covered defense contracting for the Washington Post. The second was Kevin Huang, who ran an investigative podcast about corporate fraud. And the third was a freelancer named Sophie Brennan, who'd broken several stories about government corruption. I started with Huang because his podcast format seemed most likely to publish quickly without layers of editorial approval that could be compromised. I sent him an encrypted email with a sample of Adrian's evidence and a brief explanation that my brother had been killed for collecting this information. He responded within 2 hours asking to meet in person, his message including a location in Portland, and instructions to take specific transportation routes to ensure I wasn't followed. The meeting with Huang happened in a library private study room he'd reserved under a fake name, his paranoia matching mine, as we both checked for recording devices before talking. He reviewed the evidence I'd brought with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of story, asking detailed questions about Adrian's employment timeline and the specific contracts Sentinel had falsified. Huang explained he'd been investigating private military contractors for his podcast for 2 years, that he'd heard rumors about Sentinel's hiring practices, but had never been able to confirm them, and that this evidence was exactly what he needed to publish a series that could actually spark federal action. He said he wanted to verify everything independently before going public, that he'd need at least 2 weeks to confirm the documents were authentic and interview sources, and that I should disappear somewhere safe until the story broke because Sentinel would absolutely come after me once they realized what was happening. I asked Huang if he thought Adrian's death was really murder, or if I was constructing conspiracy theories from grief and coincidence. He looked at me seriously and said that 3 other whistleblowers who'd tried to expose contractor fraud in the past decade had died in circumstances that were officially ruled accidents or suicides, that this was a pattern anyone paying attention would recognize, and that I should assume Sentinel was capable of anything until proven otherwise. That conversation ended with me agreeing to go to my parents' cabin in rural Montana where cell service was minimal and visitors would be obvious, while Huang worked on verifying the evidence and building his story. I left Portland feeling simultaneously relieved that someone was taking this seriously and terrified that I'd set events in motion that I couldn't control. The cabin was 3 hours from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable in winter, surrounded by forest that provided natural security through isolation. My parents had bought it 30 years ago as a retirement project, and Adrian and I had spent summers there as kids, learning to fish and hike and appreciate silence. Being there without him felt wrong. Every room filled with memories of us exploring the woods and staying up late telling stories, but it was the safest place I could think of while Huang worked on his investigation. I spent the first week checking news compulsively for any indication that someone was looking for me, expecting federal agents or worse to show up at any moment. Nothing happened, and the silence became almost more unnerving than activity would have been. Huang sent me encrypted updates every few days, brief messages confirming he was making progress, and warning me not to contact anyone from my normal life. He said he'd verified the financial documents with a forensic accountant who confirmed the wire transfers were real and traceable to Sentinel's corporate accounts. that he'd interviewed 2 former Sentinel employees who corroborated the falsified background check process, and that he'd submitted Freedom of Information requests for the government contracts Adrian had documented. The story was coming together, and Huang estimated he could publish in another week once he'd given Sentinel a chance to respond to his questions per journalistic standards. I told him to be careful with that notification, because alerting them too early would give them time to destroy evidence or worse, but he assured me he'd done this before and knew how to time the reveal for maximum impact. Day 9 at the cabin, I woke to the sound of a vehicle approaching on the dirt road, engine noise carrying through the morning quiet in a way that sent adrenaline flooding through my system. I moved to the window and watched a black SUV pull up to the cabin, 2 men in casual clothes getting out and looking around with the careful assessment of people trained in surveillance. They didn't announce themselves or knock, just spread out to cover the front and back exits, while a third person emerged from the vehicle. The third person was a woman in her 50s, wearing expensive business clothes, completely inappropriate for the wilderness, her posture radiating authority as she walked toward the front door. I grabbed my phone to call for help and realized there was no signal, that I was completely isolated with 3 people who'd somehow tracked me to a location only my parents knew about. The woman knocked and called out that she just wanted to talk, that she was from Sentinel Risk Solutions, and understood I had some concerns about the company that could be addressed through conversation rather than public conflict. Her voice was calm and reasonable, the tone of someone used to negotiating high-stakes situations, and that reasonableness made her more frightening than overt threats would have been. I stayed silent, and she continued talking through the door, saying she knew about the evidence Adrian had collected, and that there were explanations for everything that looked concerning, that Adrian had misunderstood what he was seeing because he didn't have full context about how government contracting worked. She said, if I gave her a chance to explain, we could reach an understanding that would benefit everyone involved, that Sentinel was prepared to be very generous in exchange for the evidence files and my agreement to let Adrian rest in peace. I moved to the back of the cabin where I'd stored my grandfather's hunting rifle, an old bolt-action weapon I barely knew how to use, but that felt necessary as the situation escalated. The woman's voice continued from the front, her patience starting to fray as she explained that I was making things difficult unnecessarily, that people had invested considerable resources in keeping certain information private, and that my stubbornness was going to force them to take measures no one wanted. She said Adrian had been given the same choice to walk away quietly and had made the wrong decision, that he'd thought he was being heroic by collecting evidence but had really just been naive about how the world actually worked. The casual way she referenced my brother's murder while standing on my porch made rage override fear, and I found myself shouting through the door that I knew they'd killed him, and that the evidence was already in multiple hands, so threatening me wouldn't stop the truth from coming out. The woman went quiet for a moment before she said in a different tone that if the evidence was already distributed, then I'd made my choice and would have to live with the consequences. She walked back to the SUV and the 3 of them drove away, leaving me shaking with adrenaline and trying to figure out if I'd just won a standoff or signed my own death warrant. I hiked 2 miles to a ridge where I could sometimes get minimal cell signal and managed to send Huang a message explaining what had happened. His response came an hour later telling me to get out of the cabin immediately, that Sentinel finding me meant they had resources I'd underestimated, and that staying isolated made me vulnerable. He said to drive to the nearest FBI field office and request protective custody while explaining I was a witness in a federal fraud investigation, that even if some agents were compromised, going officially on record would make it harder for Sentinel to act against me. I packed what I could carry and drove toward Billings where the nearest FBI office was located, taking back roads and checking constantly for vehicles following me. The drive took 6 hours because I kept detouring and doubling back, paranoia making me see threats in every car that appeared behind me for more than a few minutes. The FBI field office was in a bland government building downtown, and I walked in at 4 in the afternoon, asking to speak with someone about a federal contractor fraud case. The receptionist made me wait 90 minutes before an agent named Wilson finally called me back to a conference room and asked what this was about. I explained everything starting with Adrian's death and the email I'd received, through the evidence he'd collected and Huang's investigation, ending with the confrontation at the cabin that morning. Wilson listened without interrupting, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that suggested he was actually processing what I was saying rather than dismissing it as paranoia. Wilson left me in the conference room for another hour before returning with 2 other agents and a laptop. He said they'd pulled the case file on Adrian's death and confirmed it had been closed with minimal investigation, which raised questions given the evidence I was describing. He asked if I could provide copies of Adrian's files, and I gave him the external drive I'd brought as backup, watching as they spent 2 hours reviewing the contents with increasing seriousness. The senior agent, a woman named Valdez, finally looked up and said this was significantly worse than standard contractor fraud, that if even a fraction of Adrian's documentation was accurate, it represented a massive security breach and systematic criminal conspiracy. She said they would open an immediate investigation and that I would need to stay in protective custody until they could assess the threat level. That Sentinel had enough reach to make witness intimidation a serious concern. Protective custody meant a safe house in a suburb I wasn't allowed to identify, shared with a federal marshal who said very little but stayed alert in a way that made me feel both secure and terrified about what he was protecting me from. Huang's podcast series dropped 3 days later. 6 episodes released simultaneously covering every aspect of Sentinel's fraud, with audio interviews from former employees and analysis of the financial documents Adrian had collected. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for the company. Their stock price collapsed within hours as investors fled. Government agencies announced they were suspending all Sentinel contracts pending investigation, and Gregory Voss issued a statement claiming the allegations were false and motivated by competitors trying to damage the company's reputation. That statement fell apart when the FBI executed search warrants on Sentinel's offices the same day, agents carrying out boxes of documents while news cameras filmed from the street. The coverage intensified over the following week as more details emerged. Federal prosecutors announced they were pursuing criminal charges against Voss and 17 other Sentinel executives for fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying federal documents. The State Department admitted that 3 security incidents at overseas facilities had been linked to improperly vetted Sentinel employees, including one case where classified materials had been photographed by someone with undisclosed foreign contacts. Congressional committees announced hearings to investigate how the fraud had gone undetected for so long and which government officials had failed in oversight responsibilities. Adrian's name appeared in every story, journalists describing him as a whistleblower who'd paid with his life for trying to expose corruption, and suddenly his death was being re-examined as a probable homicide rather than a random crime. Detective Finch called me at the safe house using a number the marshals provided, her voice carrying a mix of vindication and anger as she explained her department had reopened Adrian's case after federal pressure made it impossible to keep ignoring. She said they'd identified the man who'd killed my brother through security footage analysis that had mysteriously been unavailable during the initial investigation, that the suspect was a known associate of a private investigator Sentinel had hired for quote-unquote corporate security matters, and that he was currently cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The killer had admitted he'd been paid $15,000 to make Adrian's death look like a mugging, that he'd been given Adrian's schedule and told to make it appear random. Finch said hearing that confession had made her physically ill, knowing she'd been right about the murder but had been pressured into dropping it, and she was sorry she hadn't fought harder to pursue the investigation despite the political obstacles. The trial preparation consumed 6 months of my life as federal prosecutors built their case against Sentinel's leadership. I testified before grand juries 3 separate times, walking them through Adrian's evidence and explaining the timeline of his discovery and death. The proceedings were sealed, but leaks to media suggested the government was pursuing charges that could result in decades of prison time for the main defendants, that this was being treated as one of the most significant contractor fraud cases in years. Defense attorneys tried multiple strategies to undermine the evidence, claiming Adrian had fabricated documents because he was disgruntled about his employment, arguing that the background check failures were honest mistakes rather than intentional fraud, suggesting that Adrian's death was unrelated to his whistleblowing and that the killer was lying to reduce his sentence. None of these arguments survived scrutiny as prosecutors presented overwhelming documentation of systematic fraud and deliberate cover-up. Gregory Voss took the stand in his own defense and spent 3 days trying to claim he'd been unaware of the falsified background checks, that rogue employees had acted without his knowledge to cut corners, and that he'd run an ethical company that had been undermined by people he'd trusted. The prosecution destroyed him with his own emails, showing message after message where he'd explicitly approved hiring unvetted personnel and discussed strategies to avoid detection. They played portions of Adrian's video testimony where he described reporting the problems internally and being told by his direct supervisor to delete everything, then showed email chains proving that supervisor had consulted with Voss before giving those instructions. By the time cross-examination finished, Voss looked less like a successful businessman and more like someone who'd gambled everything on not getting caught and lost. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Voss and 12 other executives. Sentencing came 2 months later, and the judge clearly intended to send a message about contractor fraud and whistleblower retaliation. Voss received 28 years in federal prison. His operations director got 22 years, and the others received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. The man who'd killed Adrian was sentenced to life without parole after the plea deal fell apart due to public outcry about giving reduced time to an assassin. Financial penalties totaled over $300 million as the court ordered restitution to the government for fraudulent billing and damages to the families affected by the security breaches that resulted from unvetted personnel. Sentinel Risk Solutions filed for bankruptcy during the trial, its remaining assets liquidated to pay criminal penalties and civil lawsuit settlements. My parents attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with photographs of Adrian that they'd brought from home, wanting the jury to see the person whose life had been taken for corporate profit. My mother told reporters outside the courthouse that she'd never wanted justice to mean this much pain, that she'd trade every guilty verdict to have her son back, but since that wasn't possible, She needed the people responsible to understand the magnitude of what they'd destroyed. My father said less, but his anger was visible in every tense line of his body, the way he stared at the defendants with an intensity that made them look away. After sentencing, we went to Adrian's grave, and my mother laid flowers while telling him that the people who'd killed him were going to prison, that his evidence had protected others from the same fate, and that we loved him and missed him every single day. I received another email from Adrian's account 3 days after the sentencing, the same address that had started everything 7 months earlier. This time, the subject line said, "Thank you," and the message body was empty, except for a single line. "I knew you'd make sure they couldn't get away with it. You always had my back." I sat staring at that message, trying to figure out if someone had hacked his account again, or if I'd somehow set up an automated message and forgotten, or if I was supposed to believe my dead twin had somehow reached across death one more time. The rational explanation was that I'd created some kind of delayed send during the investigation, and my grief-damaged memory had blocked it out. But part of me wanted to believe Adrian had found a way to acknowledge that justice had been served, that he could rest, knowing the truth had been exposed. 4 years later, I still have both emails saved in a folder I can't bring myself to delete. The first one that set everything in motion, and the final one that felt like closure. I changed careers after the trial, leaving my job in software development to work for a nonprofit that supports whistleblowers and their families, helping people navigate the impossible choice between speaking truth and protecting themselves. Every person I work with reminds me of Adrian, their courage in facing powerful institutions that want them silent, their determination to expose wrongdoing even when the personal cost is catastrophic. I tell them Adrian's story when they ask why I do this work, about the email from a dead man that led to justice for dozens of people his evidence protected. Some days I believe that email was random chance, a hacker or a ghost in the machine. Other days I believe Adrian found a way to make sure his death meant something, reaching out one final time to give me the tools to finish what he'd started. Either way, the result was the same. The truth came out, and the people responsible paid for what they'd done, and my brother's final message to me, real or imagined, had been the catalyst that made all of it possible. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.